Okay, so I'm going to talk through kind of the first two explanations for innovation or growth that there is, and then I'll spend a little more time on the third one, which will be kind of the one that'll be the focus of this class. So, essentially, you want to think about this. You could think about this at the country level or the individual level, where at the country level, what we're talking about is why is this switch get flipped? Why does all of a sudden we get this innovation? So why does that happen? Why does that happen where it happens first, which is England in like late 1700s, early 1800s? At the individual level, you can think of like, okay, why is this person, economically successful versus, somebody else? So we have different explanations at the country level, or you could think about it over time, or you could compare countries, at a snapshot. Why is this country rich in this time period versus this other country that is not as rich? And so, broadly, there are all sorts of explanations, and these are very thorny and very contentious. Um, and so we're just going to kind of go, I'm just going to kind of discuss what they are and the different like schools of thought behind them before focusing in on the one that we are going to talk about in this class. These things are fabulously complex. All right. So these things are, if you think about why one country is rich versus another country, or even at the individual level, why somebody is successful, you're not going to find one thing. Now, unfortunately, in the present, we are very reductive. The media is very reductive, where they're always looking for kind of one explanation. We're gonna find the one thing that explains this. There's gonna be one huge causal factor. Now, the world's almost never like that. It's almost always, this is there's whatever, a tangled web. There's lots of different things that go into, who you are, why you are, and at the country level, why this country has, ended up where it's at, in economic growth, or why it has the innovation it has. This is just, it's fabulously complex. It's not monocausal. And in fact, I would encourage you to be very wary just as you go through life of people who are trying to tell you this is the one reason. There's never one reason. Okay. Now, that being said, I'm going to go through the three reasons. And in this class, we're going to focus on one of them, institutions. But all these things are obviously going on. So broadly, we're thinking about economic growth, innovation. Um, the three explanations kind of, they boil down to there are cultural explanations, there are geography or resource explanations, and then there are institutions. Okay. So the first explanation is kind of culture or a values explanation. So you think about this at the individual level, you'd say something like, that person is rich because they worked hard. That would be kind of a cultural explanation, that they have some sort of culture of hard work. At the country level, it'd be like this country fosters curiosity or, work ethic or something like that. That would be kind of a cultural explanation. It's kind of like the informal rules of this society are producing innovation or producing a strong work ethic. There's also the flip side, saying, well, the reason this person is rich is because they are good at exploiting other people, or the reason this country is rich is because they exploited other countries or other groups. And so you see kind of, you hear these sorts of explanations. You hear them primarily in the public discourse. So you hear them both for individuals and both for countries. At the academic level, they've kind of fallen out of fashion. There's some writings on it. Um, more. You have some people kind of thinking more about the culture and its role on growth. And you have Joel McCure, who's kind of looking at kind of like the early invention societies in England, and he's really focused on culture. You have someone like Amy Chua, who's like looking at the present and looking at the various successful groups in the U.S. Like Nigerians and Mormons, and she has a whole book called The Triple Package, where she looks at all these groups and tries to identify commonalities. All this stuff's super controversial. Anytime you're dealing with culture, it's like very controversial. Um, and I don't have tenure, so I don't really want to delve into it that much. But largely, this is an economic, and also this is economic class, and economic growth is mostly about institutions. So I will just say about culture, it's something to pay attention to. In this class, we're going to focus on institutions, but it's something to think about. Um, but fundamentally, what's difficult about it is that it's hard to capture numerically. So when an economic historian is doing economic history, we're often looking for data sets. We're looking for, what can the data reveal about the past? It's hard to quantify something as qualitative as culture, somewhat of a fool's errand. So that's another reason we're not going to delve too deep into it. It's just something that's really hard um, to quantify, and it's touchy. Although interestingly enough, I think one of the reasons it's touchy is people view it as immutable. Um, but there are some aspects of culture that can be changed. Something like religion, countries can switch religions. Or you can adopt, if you think about even as your teenage years, you kind of move through different subcultures, like, I was a teenager. Oh, I was into punk rock for this is so embarrassing. I was in the punk subculture. Then I was in the surf subculture. Then I got, really into, in high school, like DJ, or in college, like DJ subculture, kind of move through these subcultures. So anyways, it's something obviously to be aware of, and I don't want to be naive and not and think that I'm not aware of it. But like I said, it's just something that is very controversial and also very hard to quantify. So it's going to be a little bit outside the scope of this class, but those explanations are out there. People from the left, people from the right, both have different cultural explanations for growth, both at the individual and the country level. So should discuss it, but we're not going to get too in depth with it. Geography is the other big one. So historically, you're thinking about why some countries are rich, why some countries are poor. The geographic explanation would say some countries are better situated geographically than others. Famously, this comes from Jared Diamond. So Jared Diamond is professor at UCLA, wrote this big book on germs and steel. Actually, my first year when I was an undergrad at UCLA. And I remember very first lecture I ever attended. The professor gets up in front of the class and says, "My colleague just wrote the greatest book of history ever, Guns, Germs, and Steel. All go out and buy it." So diligent. My first class of college, I bought it, read it. Pretty boring book, very repetitive, but the ideas in it are very influential, and very good ideas. I mean, good in the sense that they are, revolutionary in many ways. And you can read about Diamond's thesis. Essentially, his thesis is that, guns, germs, and steels. The reason why, during the colonial era, Europe comes to dominate is because it has these geographic advantages. Basically, it's blessed with the best crops and the best animals. So it's got all the good crops, it's got all the good animals. This leads to some level of civilization. With civilization living in cities comes germs. Those germs and the guns, allow Europe to subjugate the rest of the world during the colonial era. So it's Diamond's argument is essentially, geography is destiny. The individual level, you can think about this as the resources someone's endowed with, or even at the, beyond geography, certain countries are successful because of the resources that they are endowed with. I think the geographic argument kind of holds water in the zero sum world, but when you think about the present, you think about rich countries in the present, you have plenty of examples of countries that developed with no resources. Japan's the first non-European country to go through sustained economic growth. They have no resources. Singapore, no resources. Hong Kong, no resources. Essentially no resources. They are nicely geographically located in terms of trade, but they have essentially no natural resources. So I think post zero sum world, when you get into innovation, it's not. I don't think the geographic explanation holds as much weight, although it's very, very popular. And even if you take high school, it's usually taught. Okay, let's take a break before delving into institutions, which will be our preferred explanation. And again, not that this is the one and only explanation, it's just the one we're going to focus on. These other things are obviously important. You think about the US, again, culture is tough to quantify, tough to say, what exactly the influence is. But in geography, the US has a lot of natural resources and a lot of land, okay, which is going to be very important, certainly very important to that initial level of growth. It's going to be why US is richer initially than Europe, than its European counterparts, is because there's a lot of land. So we'll get to institutions next.